Hello and thank you for joining us on the Capitol Report on NTD television. I'm Steve Lance. Here's a look at some of the stories we've been following for you today. Congress is acting to revoke Russia's normal trade status. Russia may soon default on its debt for the first time in over a century, and President Biden could make a trip to Europe soon. We'll bring you the latest. The U.S. and China today held the first high-level in-person talks on Ukraine. What did they say, and how are they reacting to reports that Beijing is helping the Russian military? As Russia's war in Ukraine wages on and the world watches, there's another war being waged behind the scenes. America is being tested on many fronts. We take a look at that as well as the battle back home for Second Amendment rights. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky will address members of Congress in a virtual call. We'll have the details coming up. As fighting around Ukraine's capital continues, Ukraine and Russia held their fourth round of diplomatic talks, but with no success. And Congress this week is expected to officially revoke Russia's preferred trade status. NTD's Melina Wisecup has the latest.
The White House has imposed one sanction after another on Russia, and once again this week, Congress's legislative agenda is dominated by Russia action. This time, they're set to approve President Biden's move to strip Russia of its preferred trade status. It will make it harder for Russia to trade with the West and could impact international supply chains. The economic uncertainty of Russia has global consequences, especially in Europe.
And we know that this impact will not be negligible. It will be a serious impact because of the soaring prices of commodities, because of the consequences of inflation on some raw materials.
And lingering in the background, the possibility that Russia could default on its debt for the first time in over a century. Ukraine's president thanks Biden for the sanctions imposed so far, but he wants the U.S. to do more, like cut Russia off from international waters. President Biden remains committed to not sending U.S. troops to fight.
He's been very clear and consistent about that he does not have the intention of sending U.S. troops to Ukraine. That has not changed.
And President Biden could be heading to Europe soon. But Press Secretary Jen Psaki says no official decision has been made on this so far. If Biden does go to Europe, it would be the first time since the war broke out. Vice President Kamala Harris has already visited Europe twice in the past month. Meanwhile, Congress is set to take up yet another package of sanctions.
Melina, does it look like we'll see both parties supporting these new sanctions?
Well, Steve, we do expect to see a unified Congress this week as they vote to revoke Russia's preferred trade status. But there may be a few outlier votes. We saw 17 House members last week vote no on that ban on Russian oil imports. Now, the 15 Republicans that voted no said they did so because they didn't want to do anything that would hurt Americans. With gas prices at record highs, they didn't want to vote for this in fears that it may raise those gas prices even more. There were also two progressives who joined Republicans in voting no. One of those progressives says that she questions whether this would actually target those Russian oligarchs, and she fears that these sanctions could hurt Russian people and Europeans. The other progressive who voted no on that Russian oil import and the other sanctions says that she doesn't want to encourage drilling for oil on U.S. lands, and she fears that these sanctions do little to incentivize Russia to de-escalate the conflict over there. So we do expect Congress to move quickly and overwhelmingly pass this new package of sanctions to revoke Russia's trade status this week, although we may see those few outlier votes. Steve, back to you.
NTD's Melina Wisecup reporting. And top U.S. and Chinese officials met today to discuss Beijing's support for Russia. It comes amid reports that Beijing is helping Moscow militarily. NTD's Iris Tao has more.
Top advisors to President Biden and Chinese regime leader Xi Jinping met in Rome today, discussing China's support for Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
It was an intense 7-hour session reflecting the gravity of the moment.
It's the first high-level U.S.-China meeting since the war broke out, and the two sides talked for 7 hours behind closed doors. The White House said a substantial part of it was on Russia and Ukraine, while adding a warning for China.
Should they provide military or other assistance that, of course, violates sanctions or supports the war effort, that there will be significant consequences.
The meeting came amid reports that Russia has asked China for military help, and also reports citing unnamed U.S. officials say that Beijing has indeed signaled a willingness to help. The White House was repeatedly pressed on it today, but sounded vague.
Well, what we're going to be watching closely, of course, is actions.
Both Russia and China have denied the accusations. And before leaving Washington for today's meeting, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said the U.S. is watching closely to see to what extent Beijing supported Russia.
Is a concern of ours, and we have communicated to Beijing that we will not stand by and allow any country to compensate Russia for its losses from the economic sanctions.
Reporting in Washington, D.C., Iris Tao, NTD News.
House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer are inviting members of Congress to attend a virtual address by Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. The virtual call is scheduled for Wednesday at 9 a.m. According to the invitation, the virtual address is only open to members of Congress. It will be held at the Capitol Visitor Center Congressional Auditorium. The invitation notes great respect and admiration for the Ukrainian people. The memo also mentions Congress's intent to pass bills to cripple Russia's economy. As the Ukrainians take up arms to defend their own country from a foreign enemy, we're reminded of the significance of our own Second Amendment. To discuss both of those issues, we have Texas Congressman Michael Cloud. Congressman Michael Cloud, thank you so much for joining us on the Capitol Report.
Sure thing. Good to be here.
Now, Congressman, we're seeing the war in Ukraine escalate as Russia advances through the city of Kiev. We also saw a bombing in Iraq tied to Iran. China has just now encroached on Taiwanese airspace yet again. It feels as though the U.S. is being tested on multiple fronts. What do you make of all of this?
We certainly are being tested on a number of fronts, and tragically, part of this is because the Biden administration shares something with Putin, and that is that the Biden administration wants a multipolar world. And so we can go back to 1997 when Russia and China signed a joint agreement saying, let's push toward a multipolar world. In other words, one with competing powers instead of one in which the United States is preeminent. Then we see, fast forward 10 years later, Vice President Biden, in a speech, ironically now, tragically, in the Ukraine, said, we are trying to create a multipolar world. Well, this is what a multipolar world looks like. So we're being tested on a number of fronts, and we desperately need an America First, strong stance coming out of the White House.
Now, Congressman, with so much going on around the world, it just seems like crisis after crisis. I think a lot of what's happening domestically back here in the U.S. can kind of we can lose sight of it, if you will. I want to ask you about a bill that you recently introduced that has over 50 co-sponsors, which is quite significant. The bill's called the No Registry Rights Act, and it essentially requires the ATF to delete all previously recorded gun sale history, and correct me if I'm wrong, from their database. Why is that important?
Well, that's important because, while we talk about all the things that are going on in the geopolitical sense, one of the things we'll hear a lot, even from, out of the best intentions, you'll hear a lot of people say that the primary job of the federal government is to keep us safe. Well, the primary job of the federal government is actually to keep us free. Keeping us safe is an important part of it, but keeping us free is the essential priority. And so it's important that we stand up for civil liberties. Well, back at the end of last year, we got word that the ATF had collected over 54 million gun records in 1 year alone. Couple that with the Biden administration wanting to extend through a proposed rule the requirement for FFLs, or basically gun vendors to extend how long they keep their records indefinitely. So we began an investigation and come to find out that the ATF had over time collected almost 1 billion gun records. They had put them into a database in digital format in a way that's searchable. Now, this is in spite of the fact that current federal law already prohibits the ATF from creating a federal gun registry. And so you look at a database with almost 1 billion gun records in it, that's an astronomical figure in a searchable database. It comes really close to that line of a gun registry, if not crossing it. And so we're pushing back on it. We've introduced this legislation that would call for that database to be dismantled. And like you said, over 50 co-sponsors on it already.
Over time, do you think that we've lost track of why we hold the Second Amendment so dear as a nation?
Certainly, some will try to point toward hunting rights or sporting rights, and certainly that's part of it. But it's really about our protection. It's about ensuring tyranny doesn't enter into our government. It's about ensuring that each individual has the right to protect themselves and their families. In the last year, we've seen crime spike in cities, and so you see people from every demographic suddenly realizing personally the need to be able to protect themselves. We've seen the defund the police movement cause for lags in response time, in spite of the fact that the law enforcement are doing everything they can with the means that they have to protect and serve their communities, but we see politicians stepping in the way of that. And so, it's quite important that this, among many civil rights liberty issues, and we've seen, a number of the alphabet soup of agencies. We've seen the IRS target conservatives. We saw legislation being proposed that would put them basically in every American's checkbook. We saw the DOJ begin to label parents stepping up and speaking out at school board meetings as domestic terrorism. We saw DHS recently reconstruct their threat terrorism to where now the number one threat terrorism is, in their opinion, according to the United States, is people who, quote, spread misinformation as of course defined by their politically appointed leadership. And so this is a time for us as Americans to realize we have to stand up and uphold the Constitution, that Constitution that was put in place to put government in a box, specifically so they do not overstep what we understood to be our God-given liberties.
Texas Congressman Michael Clout, thank you.
Thank you.
A bipartisan group of senators is asking the Department of Homeland Security for an update on U.S. readiness to face cyber attacks from Russia. 22 senators, led by Senators Jackie Rosen of Nevada and Mike Rounds of South Dakota, are asking Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas for a briefing. The United States has imposed heavy sanctions on Russia for its invasion of Ukraine. In a letter to Mayorkas, the senators said that retaliation in the form of cyber attacks from Russia is a concern. The letter noted past Russian cyber efforts to steal intellectual property and spread disinformation. An award-winning American journalist was shot dead in Ukraine on Sunday. The shooting occurred while he was reporting from a suburb of Kiev, the Ukrainian capital. Another journalist was wounded.
We crossed the first bridge in Irpin. We're going to film other refugees leaving, and we got into a car. Somebody offered to take us to the other bridge, and we crossed a checkpoint, and they start shooting at us. So the driver turned around, and they kept shooting. It's two of us. My friend is Brent Renault, and he's been shot and left behind.
His fallen colleague, Brent Renault, was an award-winning filmmaker from Arkansas. The 50-year-old was reporting in the Kyiv suburb when Russian forces fired on the vehicle he was riding in. U.S. State Department spokesman Ned Price on Twitter condemned the attacks. In 5 shootings targeting homeless people in Washington, D.C. and New York City, police need your help to find the suspect. Crime across America is raging out of control. Many blue cities which called to defund the police are now seeing record surges in violent crime. We sit down with Congresswoman Nicole Malliotakis, who represents part of New York City, to discuss. And Democratic Senator Joe Manchin today said that he opposes Joe Biden's pick for a powerful position on the Federal Reserve Board. Who and why? We'll find out in just a while. Hello and welcome back to NTD's Capitol Report. I'm Steve Lance. Authorities are looking for a man they say is targeting the homeless people in Washington, D.C. and New York City. You can see the suspect here in these surveillance pictures. Police say they believe he shot 5 homeless men over the past 2 weeks.
2 individuals were shot while sleeping on the streets. Not committing a crime, but sleeping on the streets.
Police in D.C. and New York are working together along with federal agencies on the investigation. They're offering a reward of $55,000 for information leading to an arrest. New York City has recently launched an aggressive campaign to clear the subways of homeless people and connect them with shelters and food banks. Multiple Democratic-run cities are using this as an impetus to remove homeless camps throughout the streets. And Congresswoman Nicole Malliotakis' congressional district includes Staten Island and part of Brooklyn in New York City. With the recent change in leadership in New York City, we had a chance to ask her what the outlook is for the nation's most populous city. Congresswoman Nicole Malliotakis, thank you for joining us on the Capitol Report.
Well, thank you for having me.
Now, if you could let us know, New York is a heavy Democrat state. There seems to be some key issues that our Democrats seem to be coming over on, and one of those is with the critical race theory and also with crime. Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg has been heavily criticized and has even reversed course as of late. You guys have there's a new mayor in New York City. Tell us, are things changing? I was there a few months back, and
Yeah, I mean, look, I feel that certainly having Bill de Blasio no longer as mayor is a positive thing, and Eric Adams has said the right things in terms of wanting to reinstate public safety, to his credit. I think that, there's still those politicians who keep pandering to the far left and aren't embracing the changes that need to be made. For example, New York's radical bail law, the governor, the legislative leaders continue to say that they're not going to take any action despite calls from the mayor, despite calls from members of Congress like me, and despite the rapid increase in crime you're seeing across the board, from rape to robbery to hate crimes to assaults to car thefts. You're seeing all these crimes across the board increasing, yet they don't want to take the necessary action. So, I think, yes, there's a tide turning, and New Yorkers have made it clear. 3 out of 4 New Yorkers are saying they want more public safety. They want this restored. So that's one thing. The second issue, which I think under this mayor can be corrected, is the issue of education. I stood with the Asian American community. I rallied with the Chinese American community multiple times when we were fighting Mayor de Blasio's policies to eliminate specialized schools, to eliminate gifted and talented programs, and it seems that we are winning that fight, and it seems that Mayor Adams understands the importance of those programs to challenge students at their aptitude, and I hope that we'll see those, being left alone now that we have a new mayor in town. But again, we had to fight for these things over and over again, months and months to rally this, and of course, having a new mayor helps.
Now, Congresswoman, I want to switch gears a little bit and ask you about the current situation we're seeing in Ukraine. How does the United States prevent a more fortified Russia-China alliance? And there's calls to divest from Russia. Should we be calling to divest from China before it's too late?
Well, I think if we've learned anything from the COVID pandemic is that we cannot rely on China for our supply chain. We need to start bringing our supply chain home. We need to start bringing our medication home. So much of our medication is being manufactured there, and that could be used to retaliate against us one day, as we're seeing happen to Europe with Russia right now. So I think it's really important that we're not relying on our adversaries, and it makes sense to start producing our medications here, producing the supply chain here, producing energy here. And that is the approach that I hope we'll be seeing from this president, although he has been reluctant, not only reluctant to unleash our energy potential, but he's actually putting in place policies that hamper it. He put a ban on energy exploration, federal lands. He's stopping all leasing of federal lands. He has killed the Keystone Pipeline, all while giving Russia the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. So, yes, I think the sanctions, although they've come late, are starting to work. I wish they had done them over a month ago, but I still think he needs to do more in terms of gas, oil, minerals, and pushing back on Putin in those areas.
Congresswoman, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Former President Barack Obama confirmed on Sunday that he has tested positive for the CCP virus. Obama tweeted saying that he had a scratchy throat for a couple of days, but was otherwise feeling okay. He also called on people to get the COVID-19 vaccine, but did not provide other details about his diagnosis. Nationwide, cases, deaths, and hospitalizations have declined significantly in recent months. But outside of the U.S., specifically in China, where the CCP virus originated, Recently, there has been a significant uptick, causing concern that the situation could be even worse than what the CCP would allude to. We've been watching that closely and will be sure to keep you informed. Representative Chris Smith is introducing a bill to pressure the Chinese Communist Party to stop its gross human rights violations.
That the Chinese Communist Party is vicious, it is cruel, it uses torture as an element of ensuring people's compliance.
Smith's bill could strip China of its most favored trade nation status that had been granted by Congress in 2000. Since then, China flooded the U.S. markets with its goods.
We have leverage. They're an export economy. Without that, the economy grinds to a halt. And frankly, you know, if that's what it takes to protect their people from these slave-like conditions, then we have to do it.
Last year, Congressman Smith co-sponsored the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, banning imports from the Xinjiang region due to forced labor concerns.
I think if we implement the Xinjiang law well, and if we do my bill, I think we're going to see reform.
These bills would reverse course for the U.S. by relinking economic policy to China's human rights. Senator Joe Manchin today said that he opposes Biden's pick for a powerful position on the Federal Reserve Board. Manchin said he will not vote for Sarah Bloom Raskin to be the vice chair of the Fed because Raskin criticized the fossil fuel industry. In a statement, Manchin said policy leaders need to focus on the most pressing issues, rising inflation and energy costs. He wrote, "I will not support any future nominee that does not respect these critical priorities." Raskin's nomination has been stuck in the Senate Banking Committee. Republican senators question her ties with a private firm that has gained access to the Fed. Sarah Bloom Raskin is the wife of Maryland Congressman Jamie Raskin. And that's all we have for you tonight on the Capitol Report. Thank you for tuning in. From Washington, D.C., I'm Steve Lance, and we'll see you tomorrow.